Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Contemplative Science podcast. My name is Jamie, and as always, I'm here with co-host Dr. Mark Miller. Mark, how are you, man?
Hey, James. Very good. Excited to be here.
Today's really exciting because we're lucky enough to be introducing Michael Daw. So Michael is a doctoral researcher at Northampton University, and he's interested in examining the potential relationship between spirituality, psychic abilities, and diet.
Wow.
Michael, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Thank you for asking me. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, so there's so much to discuss, but I first want to get to grips with some terms. So, what are psychic abilities?
Yeah, nice.
So psychic abilities, I mean, a whole range of things, and I'm very inclusive when I'm talking about it. So things like telepathy, supposed mind-to-mind communication, perhaps when you pick up on someone else's thoughts, precognition, when you seem to be able to know what's in the future, but right through to other ranges, things like mediums, I class as sort of psychic abilities. So people supposedly contacting the dead, channeling, similar sort of thing, but with people who've never been alive. Psychokinesis is another one where people claim to be able to, like people like Uri Geller, claim to be able to bend spoons or things, or things that are kind of less dramatic, actually. There's been a lot of evidence in support of things like people being able to influence random number generators, which is just, sort of events down at the atomic level. Quite consistently, people have been able to show that those alter far in advance what you'd expect by chance. So those are the kind of things that I mean by psychic abilities.
It seems like when you go down this sort of research hole and you talk about these issues, you have to subscribe to a non-reductionist materialist version of the world, right? We're going to say here, or perhaps not.
Well, you don't have to. I mean, there are parapsychologists who look at this kind of stuff from a skeptical point of view. But I guess if you don't think there's anything in this, then it's kind of hard to justify why you'd spend a lot of time researching it. So my guess is that most parapsychologists are, as I say, not all. There are some who I won't use the word skeptical. I mean, I think skepticism is a good trait of all scientists, but perhaps some people go beyond skepticism and just say, well, there's nothing in that, and use quite derogatory terms sometimes as well, which may be quite enlightening, the fact that they have to use such derogatory terms. But no, I mean, I got into it, for example, because I'm just really interested in the science behind these abilities, and I personally think the science behind them is quite overwhelming as well. There's a hell of a lot of evidence for particularly telepathy and psychokinesis, as I was talking about, like influencing things like random number generators and things like that.
Jamie, were you saying a second ago that you thought that this would be a non-reductionist view? Like you'd have to be non-reductionist in order to get into the psychic ability discussion? Because I don't know if that's the case. I mean, you could be a completely materialist if that's what you were saying. You can be a complete materialist and still think that it's just a hell of a lot spookier than we think it is. Because actually we make all these abstractions all the time, like, oh, well, we just know how it is. But I think it's far more far out than we potentially think it is.
Well, that's the tension, isn't it? Because my assumptions about what materialism mean kind of are revealing, right? You assume a materialism means X without necessarily, and I guess that's the tension. I mean, Michael, you just spoke about the evidence or the science for was it telekinesis?
Yeah, telekinesis, psychokinesis, same thing.
Can we chat about that?
Yeah, nice.
Yeah, I mean, so there's quite a lot of work was done at the Princeton University, what was called the Pear Lab. So there was a guy called Bob Yarn, who was an engineering professor there in about the 80s, I think, and one of his graduate students came to him with a project where they wanted to look into potential mind over matter, whether people could influence random number generators. And Bob Yarn thought, he didn't think there was going to be anything in it, but he thought it would make a good project. He thought there'd be engineering there to build a random number generator, there'd be statistics and all the rest of it. So he said, yeah, go ahead, I'll supervise that. Lo and behold, his student found significant effects, that people did seem to be able to influence random number generators. And he thought, gosh, is there something in this? So he repeated the experiment, and lo and behold, found similar results. And then he kind of altered the course of his career. He and a colleague, Brenda Dunn, set up this lab, and they spent a lot of time looking at these different random number generators and how people could perhaps maybe influence what the course of these things, and in the end found highly significant results, which I think are pretty persuasive that something's going on. And these days, people are doing some very interesting research around using random number generators.
So how do they go about changing the random number generator? I mean, what are they asked to do? Like just set the intention for, may the numbers that are coming out be more ordered than less ordered, something like this?
Yeah, well, they invented lots of different things to do. But I mean, the most simple way, I mean, if you think of a random number generator, it's just generating ones and zeros. So it's like someone tossing a coin, heads and tails. And it's like, if you want to influence it, you could say, well, just go for ones more. Try and have what. But there's other ways of doing that. And you can, they did, for example, they set this like little robot up, this robot which basically kind of moved in random ways depending on the random number generator. They put it in the middle of a table, and you'd expect it to just kind of go, dot around in a kind of random walk. But because it was kind of quite tactile, or it could be, you could see it and you could see what was going on. If you stand at one point of that table and you just kind of like beckon it, maybe you can make it come towards you. And effectively what you're doing then is just influencing a random number generator. Right. But it kind of becomes a bit more of an emotional thing. It becomes a bit more of a game thing, and you can engage with it more. So I think, well, I don't know, but it's possible that they got better results with that.
And are some people better at this than others? Is that what the experiments are showing? Or is it like anybody who sets the intention, like we're seeing in physics, with the slit, the whole experiments, where somebody's watching it and then suddenly the matter acts differently? Is it like that? Or is it like people can train for this, and particular kinds of people in particular kinds of contexts empower these kinds of outcomes?
I believe people. I believe so. By the way, I'm not an expert in psychokinesis, but I mean, as far as I know, I think people do. I mean, J.B. Ryan, who was who many people know because he invented these kind of Zener cards, which were he tested telepathy. So people know these cards. They've got like a wiggly lines or star, circle, and things. And he asked people to try and predict what would be or try and know what cards were coming up. I think he made a point of trying to select people who seemed particularly good at that, and then test those people to try and get more significant results. And certainly in my research, so I've interviewed people, professional psychics, people who kind of make their money out of doing this kind of thing, and they say that they are able to do that, and other people actually. I mean, if you go onto, obviously the internet is full of people, but there's some people who actually offer training in this. I can't remember his name now. There's a guy called Sean who set up this. It's sort of what they call a pinwheel. So there's like a piece of foil on a pin, and put it under a bell jar so that it's not influenced by the wind or air currents and things like that. And then he kind of tries to get it to turn in different directions. And he reckons that, you can learn how to do that. And people say they can do that. They say they read this book, they practice the intentions, and then they can make these things happen on demand.
So then the question is there a spiritual significance? And I'm interested in how you might define spiritual significance to them.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's a really good question. Now, I think that these things are connected because I think, for me at least, spirituality is about the interconnectedness of all things. And so if you believe that everything is connected at a sort of fundamental non-material level, or whatever, or whether that's a class of material, who knows, but let's leave that to one side, then it seems natural to be able to share thoughts, if you like, or even to interact with matter, or your mind to interact with matter. And so I think that this is I think that these, whilst they're kind of seen as psychic, I actually think sort of psychic abilities may be signs of a sort of certain level of tapping into sort of spirituality, if you like. And indeed, people say, you're probably aware, in particularly in Indian philosophies, but where they talk about the siddhis, so they talk about these sort of supernormal powers that people say that that's kind of like, it's almost like a side effect of going on a spiritual path. If you become certain stages of enlightenment, then you become able to be able to interact with matter, to be able to do things like levitate and all sorts of other things which we would see as sort of psychic type things. So I think that these are two sides of the same coin personally, and that's why the sort of topic of my PhD is both spirituality and psychic abilities, because I think that these two things are parts of the same thing.
It makes sense, and that also, I think that's a definition that I haven't heard that definition before, but it makes a lot of intuitive sense to me, because I mean I'm going to quote something at you here. In ancient Greece, and I'm going to not get the pronunciation right, Apollonius of Tyana was said to be able to levitate his body, foresee the future, and perform healing, due in part to his vegetarian diet of bread, dried fruits, vegetables, and wild herbs, which kept his senses in a kind of indescribable celestial clearness. And what I wanted to ask you was, what do you perceive the relevance and role of diet to be?
Well, I think what Apollonius and others have reported is that it seems to be that diet is important to both developing spirituality and also manifesting sort of supernormal powers, if you like. So Apollonius was particularly talked about what he called a light diet, and it's similar to if you go to many shamans, for example, shamans who live in the Amazon. They will frequently fast before going into some trance state, but they will also abstain from meat. So there seems to be some connection, and this was really sort of the basis for my research. Really, is noticing that a lot of spiritual religious traditions seem to connect certain dietary practices with spiritual practices, and also these spiritual practices sometimes are sort of also psychic practices, if you like. That all these things are interrelated. And I mean, we could name a number. I mean, you named the ancient Greeks there, but there's others. I mean, Pythagoras, also in the ancient Greek, he was. I mean, people know things like from his mathematical discoveries, but he did all sorts of stuff as well. He was known as a kind of mystic, and before we had the word vegetarianism, before the Victorian times, people used to call people who didn't have meat. They used to call them following a Pythagorean diet. So it's really kind of that kind of diet is synonymous with Pythagoras, and so these things are all sort of mixed up, really, in all sorts of traditions.
Yeah, you see it also in the Jewish. I mean, you probably see it in every tradition, I'd suspect. But I know the Jewish mystical tradition, like in the Zohar. I remember a passage where one of the students has a teacher who's passed away come to them in a dream, give them special teachings, and they miss the punchline. They sort of wake up or they lose the contact just as the big part of the lesson's coming. And so they fast. That's what their go-to is. They fast for I don't know how many days or weeks in the hopes that they can reestablish the connection with this past master. And they do. I can't remember how many days. I think it was like 40 days they fast in order to reestablish this connection. So you see it there again.
Yeah, no, I wasn't aware of that example, so that's interesting. So you're right, you see it all over the place. I mean, fasting in particular. I mean, each of the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, they're all associated with all their foundational figures. So Moses for Judaism, Jesus for Christianity, and Muhammad, they're all associated with kind of significant fasts. Jesus in the wilderness before he began his ministry, Moses before he went up to collect the tablets, and of course in Islam, fasting is one of the 5 pillars. It's something that every Muslim sort of ascribes to as part of that religion. So fasting is incredibly important, to those religions. And as well as many others, really. So,
and your research is particularly looking at this, right? I mean, you're looking at the relationship between psychic abilities and spirituality with diet sort of up front as a major topic. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's all sorts of aspects of diet that we might touch upon, but it's fasting and vegetarianism that I'm focused on. And it is psychic abilities that I'm also focused on. I mean, I think a lot of my background reading has been around spiritual traditions, but also authors that writing more recently, people like Rudolf Steiner, Edgar Cayce, people like that. But yeah, my sort of empirical work, the actual research is focused on psychic abilities and also fasting and vegetarianism.
When you say empirical work there, can you give us an example? Anything you've done?
Yeah, so I'm doing 3 studies
Nice.
for my PhD. So the first study is the first study was a set of interviews with professional psychics. So I interviewed 7 professional psychics. By professional, I just mean that they make their living somehow. So, for example, there were 3 mediums there. So they that's how they made their professional living. Many of them had written books and published books. But they all used fasting and vegetarianism. So I was interviewing them and discussing stuff with them because I wanted to know how they use these dietary practices, why they thought they were important to their work, and what they thought was going on. And it was really informative actually, because it wasn't just the fasting and vegetarianism, although they were really important. They told me lots of other things, for example, about following a whole food diet. So they actually said that, well, it's to do with being healthy. That was it's not solely to do with being healthy, but that's a large part of it. So a vegan diet is a healthier diet. That's what a lot of nutritional science is showing us. They thought that was also important in manifesting sort of psychic abilities as well.
Interesting.
But also the other aspect was about the ethics involved. So what's interesting was some of my participants were saying that after they'd had sort of transformative spiritual experiences, and they suddenly became, a couple of them suddenly became able to manifest sort of psychic abilities. They found that they couldn't eat meat anymore. They kind of got vivid. They kind of made them nauseous because they could picture the pain and suffering of the animal that had happened, and they just couldn't do it. So it was almost like that kind of awakening, that kind of enlightenment kind of experience turned them off meat and made them sort of be disgusted by the whole idea.
This is
Yeah, sorry, Jamie.
this is interesting because I wanted to know if the link between vegetarianism and fasting. I mean, the shared thing between those two is not eating meat, and I was wondering if, I think the phrase was celestial cleanliness in that quote I gave. Is the idea here that putting something that previously lived and suffered into your body sort of gets in the way of your ability to engage in the practices we're discussing?
Well, yeah, it might be. I mean, I think that there are different explanations. So my sort of analysis with these interviews that I did with these psychics, they came up with 3 possible explanations. One was that yeah, there may be sort of subtle qualities within the meat that kind of the suffering, that you kind of ingesting the suffering was not helpful. But the other was that it might just be simply healthier option, and having a healthier option helps with cognition. So we know that veganism, for example, and fasting both support better cognition. So if you have better cognition, perhaps you have a better capacity to exercise your kind of spiritual or psychic development. But the third, actually, what was important was around the sort of mental focus, which I guess is kind of interrelated, the kind of mental clarity that people get. And it's interesting you say that fasting and vegetarianism might be related, because a couple of my participants also said that particularly a guy called Graham Nichols, who's he teaches out of body experiences. So if people don't know what they are, that's where people's consciousness apparently is able to leave the body, so they can kind of go off independently of the body. And he actually teaches that. He runs workshops and he lectures about that. He talked about when he went on a long fast, when he started eating again, he was really conscious of what he was eating. So that the first thing he ate, maybe it was a salad, he could almost sort of sense the kind of energy in the salad. He was a lot more sensitized to that food, and he really didn't want to put anything unhealthy into his body after that. But then maybe if people are kind of stuffing their face all the time, then they're not so bothered about what goes in. There's less of a sensitivity to the kind of the quality of the food that they're eating. So he particularly did believe there was some kind of connection between fasting and vegetarianism. So which is kind of interesting.
It's so funny. I'm vegetarian and have been since I read Peter Singer in 2015. and was totally I loved the argument about sentience. And I then I was in Mongolia traveling a couple of years ago, and they don't do vegetarianism there. I mean, really.
It's only yak. It's just butter and milk and meat, isn't it?
Yeah. And the friend I was with was vegan. We both tried to eat meat on the plane over, just to try, because we're going to eat it for the next month and a half. And and it was a physiological reaction of like, whoa, this is weird, and I feel ill, I'm not quite sure about this. And I'm just for the first time making the connection that while that's certainly a physiological reaction, there's possibly something to the significance of meat itself, as opposed to not having eaten a certain kind of carb or a certain kind of fat for a while. And I wonder if there's research that supports this idea around the significance of meat when it comes to spiritual practices.
Well, I don't think there is. I mean, that's kind of what I think is quite exciting about what I'm doing, is that I'm kind of blazing a trail, really. I say that, actually, that's not quite true. There was a guy called Azak Amlani who looked into this in the 90s. So he did his doctoral thesis on a similar topic, but he interviewed 12 people who transitioned from meat eating and transitioned eventually to a raw food vegan diet. And they expressed sort of similar things, but no, and I think the other thing, I mean, essentially, I mean, this isn't entirely established, but I think that we're not designed to have so scientists are not entirely in agreement on this, but a lot of scientists will say that the human body is not designed to have a meat diet. I mean, if you look at the gut length of carnivores, for example, it tends to be very short because there's a lot of toxins in meat. And so if you're a carnivore you eat the meat, you need to kind of get rid of it quickly because otherwise it will kind of pollute your body. We have very long guts, relatively speaking, so we're kind of designed as kind of herbivores. So the meat stays in our system a long time, so all the toxins that are in meat, and I think that's really what underlies some of the problems that people have when they eat meat. That's what underlies the diabetes, the cancers, and so on that are shown to be associated with eating meat. And to me, it's not surprising then that it might affect your spiritual development or your psychic development. Although I have to say, it's not. It's not a kind of slam dunk. I mean, there are plenty of people following a spiritual path who eat meat, and plenty of people who claim to be very psychic as well who also eat meat. But I just think it's kind of one of the factors that contributes, really.
What is ESP?
ESP stands for extrasensory perception. So that's kind of like what I was talking about earlier. So telepathy. So if you can pick up, so extrasensory means kind of beyond the normal senses. So if you can kind of, obviously we're sharing thoughts now, but we're sharing thoughts because we're speaking and we're sharing thoughts over the internet. So that's all very sensory. But if I suddenly knew what maybe you were thinking of, I don't know, a cake now, and that you then went slack-jawed and said, "My goodness, I was thinking of a cake," and that didn't seem to be any related to anything we'd just been talking about. You kind of go, well, hang on a minute, maybe you pick that up by ESP, so extrasensory perception. But that also goes for precognition, so apparently knowing the future. That's also a kind of extrasensory perception, or knowing what's going on in some other part of the world. Again, not watching the news or something, but just being able to sort of sense what's going on in some other place by kind of mental or psychic means.
Mark, do you remember having a conversation a while ago we were sort of chatting loosely about quantum physics and the fact that there are relationships between quantum physics relationships where a change over here can convey information somewhere totally different in the universe.
Yeah, and strange entanglements, I think they call it.
Yeah,
I'm not a physicist, but I love physics for that. I love physics. I love physicists for blowing my mind about what's possible. We get so we're so confident in our little Earth bubble that we know how it is, and it's very strange, very weird thing. Start thinking like actually there might be multiple dimensions, and we might be seeing gravitational forces in our dimension because there's super heavy objects one dimension over. I mean, what do you say to that? I mean, that's a very spooky example of how the universe might be,
It's true, and it's got this other feature of like quantum physics, and I don't know how relevant this is strictly, but quantum physics is showing us that there are things we don't understand about typical relationships that we can't currently explain with our current frameworks. And that's where this conversation around what you're looking at, Mike, really I can connect with. It goes, hang on, well, there are clearly relationships between things we don't understand. And there's a weight of evidence that goes to say, well, look, people can do certain activities that you wouldn't typically think are quote unquote possible. And that's why I think your work is so interesting. And it sort of leads me to ask what your predictions are for this field of research in the next 1, 5, 10 years.
Are you talking about around diet or
Diet and
ESP?
spirituality.
Around diet, I mean, that I think that a lot depends on me and whether I can get funding beyond my PhD. I mean, so I didn't tell you about the other two studies that I'm doing. So the first one was around the interviews with psychics, but what I've also done is done a survey of people who fast and people who are vegan or vegetarian. So this is people who are not necessarily classing themselves as psychic or anything, but they just follow these diets. And there seems to be a relationship really between people who are vegan or vegetarian seem to report more paranormal or psychic abilities and experiences than people who are not vegan or vegetarian. And the same with fasting as well. It's, you know, people who fast seem to report more abilities than those who do not. And what I'm currently doing is actually putting that to the test in a series of experiments. So I'm doing a sort of test of precognition to see whether people can sense some aspects of the future. And everyone, you know, basically I'm testing people who are vegan and vegetarian. I'm also testing people who eat meat, and really seeing whether there's any kind of difference, whether those people who are vegan, vegetarian perform better than people who eat meat. I mean, it's quite a small study, so to be honest, I'm not expecting sort of earth-shattering results in that. I'm only testing 40 people. 40 people seems quite daunting to me at the moment as well. I've tested 12 so far, but nevertheless, it may give us clues to do some follow-up research. I mean, so I would very much like to be able to get some funding to continue that research. On the sort of more spiritual side, actually, it would also be good to do some studies around people who are following a spiritual path to see what they notice about food as well, actually. And I think particularly because people who are into sort of mindfulness and meditation, I think that they're training themselves to kind of observe their mind quite a lot, and so I think they make actually very good experimental participants.
Indeed.
And so perhaps, you know, getting them to record what difference different foods make to their spiritual practice or the quality of their thoughts and so on may be very interesting to take this forward.
And Mike, do you have a spiritual practice, or do you have dietary edges, and have you seen anything in your own practice change from the way you eat? I mean, or is this just completely a scientific project rather than a sort of self project?
Well, I've always been interested in food, and yeah, I am a vegan, and I do fast, but I didn't start either of those practices really for their sort of spiritual aspects, I'll be honest. Fasting, I started entirely because of health reasons. So I saw what I thought was a really influential documentary about how beneficial fasting was for health. Being a vegan was mostly for environmental reasons, because it has such a huge environmental footprint and a resource footprint, really, and also for ethical reasons around animals. So this kind of came on later. I mean, I've always been interested in this side of things. So I've also been meditating for many years, but I have to say I haven't noticed, you know, much of a change in that. But that's probably got more to do with me. I mean, most of my meditation practice has really been as an aid to sort of a stress relief, really, and it's been invaluable in my life to sort of help my well-being, really, just to keep my well-being on an okay level. I mean, these days, actually, in the last year or so, I am kind of ramping up the spiritual stuff. So I'm kind of meditating a little bit more now, and experimenting with different practices and so on. But of course, it's one person is not a good, you know, it's hard to do because I'm not going to start eating meat just to see whether it makes a difference to what I'm doing. I'm not into that. So, you know, I don't know whether it makes a difference to my own practice.
Okay.
I certainly can't. I mean, it's certainly true that I can't. I don't have a very good. If I try and meditate soon after I've eaten, then it doesn't go very well. You know, there needs to be a bit of a gap, and I'm sure most meditators probably feel that. So, whether you actually need to fast, though, that's a kind of slightly different question.
I'm interested here in, because obviously there's a whole bunch of spiritual traditions. We've touched on the Jewish mysticism, and obviously meditation we think of as a primarily Buddhist pursuit. And I'm interested in whether any of the spiritual traditions can claim ownership more than any other on these kinds of abilities, and whether they have a long history relative to other traditions in exploring them.
Well, I'd say no. I mean, I don't think any religion or anything can claim ownership of any of this. I mean, I personally believe in a kind of perennial philosophy. You know, the Aldous Huxley idea of that all these religions are really talking about the same thing. Really, when they say God or Allah or whatever or Brahman, I think that's all really talking about the same stuff. But I think you know, shamanism as a tradition, you know, it's been around for tens of thousands of years. That's our if you like, our root spiritual tradition, I believe. And, you know, it's found in all different parts of the world. It's been around for tens of thousands of years. All the practices, actually, wherever they are in the world, they're all remarkably similar. So almost all instances of shamanism use fasting, for example. They also use other techniques such as drumming and chanting and so on. So you know, I think that's, you know, that's where we might look. And actually, I think, you know, I think if you talk a lot of the indigenous communities, they take these kind of spiritual and sort of supernormal powers for granted. Really, they don't regard it as something odd or strange like we do in the West or in the sort of developed world. They sort of regard it as a normal part of life. You know, that we might be able to see the future. Or, you know, there's a guy, Lawrence van der Post, was, I think, an anthropologist who worked with the Bushmen of the Kalahari, and I might have got the details wrong, but nevertheless, he told a great story that stuck in my mind, where he went out on a hunt with these Bushmen, and they'd been gone for weeks really, and they managed to make their sort of kill, and they were coming back to the village, and one of the Bushmen said to Lawrence van der Post, he says they're preparing a great celebration for us, and Lawrence van der Post said, well, how do they know you're coming home? They said, oh, they know. You know, there's this idea of the bush telegraph, which is a telepathic communication, and these people take it for granted. You know, they don't reject it like we kind of do these days, or question it, or say, oh no, you must be just imagining things. It's and of course, if you do accept it as part of normal life and part of what's going on, then it helps to foster it really. Whereas if everyone is rejecting it or saying you must be imagining things, then it tends to sort of dampen it down. So,
and I was going to say the cultural lens is really interesting, right? Because in Northern Europe we had the Enlightenment, where a certain kind of thought was prioritized, a secular thought. And you're totally right. Like, as soon as you have a strong, overwhelming cultural lens, what ends up happening is you have this positive confirmation cycle where everything that matches that lens, oh, well, that's further evidence. But everything that goes against it is dismissed. And you spoke earlier about the language that people can use in dismissing it, which speaks to kind of an attachment to the initial framework, be it the Enlightenment secular thinking, which in some ways makes us interesting case studies as opposed to those in traditions that embrace this kind of work.
yeah, and I think, I mean, you were talking about quantum physics earlier, and I think we're still, despite the fact that the discoveries of quantum physics are now 100 years old around, you know, we haven't really caught up culturally or intellectually the way we think. We still think in a kind of clockwork universe. I mean, we use new metaphors now of the computer usually. That's instead of clockworks, that's where we used to use metaphors of clockworks. Now we use metaphors of the computer when we're talking about how the brain works and things. And people just sort of, it's almost like, yeah, everyone knows about quantum physics, but that really kind of blows the kind of reductionist clockwork universe out of the water. I say it blows it out of the water, but it means that certain assumptions that come along with that kind of viewpoint, you can't take those assumptions for granted anymore. and yet I think a lot of, let's say biologists and psychologists aren't really fully aware of the implications of quantum physics. And it's interesting actually as well when you look at surveys of scientists, how much they accept ESP and whether there's a God and so on. It tends to be biologists and psychologists who are the most sort of atheistic, and it tends to be the physicists and the mathematicians that are most open to a sort of spiritual side of things, which I think is really telling. And I think maybe biologists and psychologists need a bit more of a grounding in some of the implications about quantum physics.
I love the point about because the cultural conversation and the assumptions we make culturally. It's so interesting to see how it lags behind the cutting edge of everything. I mean, if you look at the ethics of, Peter Singer, I think, made a claim in the book that in 150 years we'll look at eating meat, animals, in the same way we now look at and then enter a practice we all condemn, gladiator fighting or something. And it is interesting how we all collectively just lag behind the cutting edge research. And it's the first few people through the wall tend to take the hit.
It's sort of a good thing, though, isn't it, that we're slow to change? Because the other end of this is we make ungrounded claims, and then you have a bulk tipping point where the culture just follows suit to some weird end. Suddenly think, oh, the world's flat, and then everybody just goes, oh, it must be flat. Like, there's the new claim, let's go. And then that's no good. So I think it's probably, I know this isn't your point, JB, but I think it's kind of cool that we're slow to move. Of course, it's one of the reasons we're moving into an ecological disaster right now, I think, is because we're a bit slow to move. But we have to have a lot of compassion for ourselves, too. We were evolutionarily designed to be slow movers rather than to make super quick changes. And I think that's probably a good thing overall, and sometimes is also a bit of a problem.
It is interesting, right? Like because it is kind of a sense, right? And I think, Mike, you were hitting on this when you spoke about the fact that, people have been doing these traditions for years and years. The good bits tend to stay. Like, that's the advantage of being slow to move. It means there's kind of this evolutionary process of practices and evolutionary processes of beliefs. And one of the interesting things about this as a research topic, I think, is the fact that it has popped up in so many different cultures.
Yeah.
And so many different places, with sort of a surprising amount of consensus, and that's sort of the interesting thing.
Yeah, I have to say, I'm really quite surprised that no one has really looked at this in detail before, really, not in depth, and because it sort of seems obvious actually when you look at it, look at how prevalent diet is in various religious practices and so on. It seems an obvious thing to look at. So I'm hoping that there's going to be some traction. I'm hoping I'm going to get some papers published. Obviously, I already give presentations at conferences, do podcasts like this. But it would be good to have other people join me really and go, right, okay, this is interesting. There might be something in this. Let's pursue it more.
Do you have a sense of why this is something that's under researched and underfunded?
No, actually. Except that maybe, well, more generally, I think nutrition is only recently becoming more mainstream. I heard, I don't know what it's like in the US, but it's certainly in the UK, I heard that doctors, when in their training, they get like kind of 1 hour of nutrition training in their whole 7 years, and it's like, my goodness, it's like, what you eat is so important to our health, and yet we just don't value it. It seems like it almost doesn't matter, and that seems counterintuitive. Really, it seems obvious to me that what you eat is going to affect your body and your brain and how you think and so on. So maybe it's just because the whole of science is lagging behind really on nutritional research. It's picking up now. There's certainly a lot more research into veganism and so on than there ever used to be, and that's coming out with some interesting stuff. But I think also nutritional studies are quite hard to do because there's so many factors behind it. So many different things that people do as well as their diet. Do they exercise? And what's their mental state like, and so on and so forth. Which also makes, of course, this area hard as well because the things that I might be discovering through my surveys and my experiments, it is possible that there might be other sort of other things going on here as well that, like people being extrovert or people being hypersensitive. Maybe these are also related to diet, and maybe that's got more to do with their psychic ability and spirituality, and maybe it's got something to do with the diet as well.
This is the issue with all. I mean, this is the issue with economics in some ways, right? It's like the science of many variables, and whenever you're trying to understand many variables, nutrition's a great example, economics is a great example. You run into this problem of like, well, how do we control for extroversion? How do we control for all the things that a diet might imply about one's life?
But also, I mean, I think economics is a good example, or other. People generally don't want to fast. I'd say, people, you'd say to someone, well, why don't you just not eat for a while? They generally don't like it. I have to say, unless they do it, in which case they might value it. But and possibly the same as well for a lot of meat eaters and dairy eaters. They think when they say what's your favorite food, they might think of those things first. So it's quite psychologically different to get people to change their diet. So there might be some kind of reluctance there as well about that, and that's what I think is difficult in the culture at the moment. Even though we know fasting and being vegan is a healthy option, we also know veganism is possibly one of the things that everyone needs to be more vegan, at least if we're going to reduce the impact that we have on the world. We know that scientifically, but it's one thing to know it. It is another thing to actually kind of implement it. And I think that's one of the things that there's a drag on this, because people don't like to feel judged. People don't like to change the diet. So there's also a block. If you already eat meat and eat dairy, then why would you do research that might show that that's even more of a bad idea than it is anyway?
Mike, where is the best place for everybody to find you online?
Well, LinkedIn is possibly, if people want to connect with me, I'm on LinkedIn. That's probably the best place. I'm on Facebook. I'm increasingly on Facebook, actually, even though I possibly rather not be. It seems that I have an increasing presence on there, so you should be able to find me that way. Please do connect. I mean, it'd be great if people could connect. Always happy to hear people's experiences. Always happy to have people connect and so on.
Brilliant. Well, listen, that has been the Contemplative Science podcast. Mike, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you. You're very welcome. It's been good to meet you and good to be here.
Listen, I hope you enjoyed listening to that half as much as I've enjoyed recording it. As always, we'll see you next week. And Mike is best found on LinkedIn. Cheers, guys.